considering the unprecedented scale of the earthquake and the tsunami, the crisis management of the nation as a whole has been, in my judgment, relatively good. The number of deaths and missing, as Minister mentioned, is staggering, nearly 30,000 deaths and missing. More than 200,000 houses were destroyed. In this sense, we have little consolation. Many of the protective measures against tsunami were simply devastated. Didn't work. But if we dare to see some positive aspects, we may be reminded by the fact that the substantive number of people, including our staff and students, were actually saved as a result of practices and warning systems. The number of destroyed houses, 200,000. Death and missing is 30,000. I think the number of those who were saved were quite substantive. The crisis management of the DPJ government has not been perfect. But in my observation, it was better than the crisis management at the time of the Kobe earthquake in 1995. The then Prime Minister Murayama was criticized for its slow responses. In comparison, Mr. Kan responded fairly quickly and ordered to mobilize the self-defense forces immediately. Of course, the timing and location of the earthquake might have made some difference. The Kobe quake took place early in the morning, and the people in Tokyo area, including Prime Minister, did not feel it, as it occurred in the far away. This time, all people in Tokyo knew that this was a major earthquake. Many criticized the government for its confusing information dissemination. But given the circumstances, Mr. Edano, Chief Cabinet Secretary, tried his best to be as transparent as possible in his very frequent televised press conferences. In contrast to these two aspects, the crisis management over the nuclear power plant disaster has been, in my judgment, worse. We really thank all the workers in the Fukushima plant for their courageous efforts. But despite all of their efforts, the end of the tunnel still appears far away. Mr. Kan and the DPJ government have to accept a significant part of responsibility. But the crisis management of Tokyo Electric Power Company appeared terribly wanting. It was unfortunate that both the chairman and the president was out of Tokyo at the time of the earthquake, and that the president fell ill soon. But if the president was not well, the company should not postpone telling that fact for more than a week. The public was not sure who was in charge. Well, so much for the crisis management. What are the political implications of this disaster? One obvious political impact of the disaster is, in my understanding, ceasefire of domestic politics. Ceasefire. 4 days before March 11, the opposition was successful in pressuring Foreign Minister Maehara to step down to take responsibility for having political donations from a foreign resident in Japan. Mr. Kan's approval rating went down to less than 20%, as I said. But now, with the earthquake and the tsunami, the general election demanded by the opposition has become physically impossible for the coming months. In addition, well, not related with the earthquake, the Supreme Court decision on March 23rd was significant, as it also made the early general election legally very difficult. The Supreme Court characterized the voting power disparity of the current lower house district system as unconstitutional, although it did not declare the 2009 election invalid. The general election is now legally as well as physically very difficult. The public opinion now gives more favorable opinion to Mr. Kan, although still quite low. The Kyodo's poll of late March indicated that 28.3% supported Mr. Kan's government, as opposed to the 19.9% in February. In the face of the obvious needs of management of the triple crisis and the reconstruction, the opposition has now modified their political demands. They now need to cooperate with the government to implement the new fiscal year's budget and to create a new fiscal mechanism for reconstruction, including the supplementary budget, as well as necessary fiscal measures, possibly the introduction of new taxation targeted for reconstruction. As local election campaigns are now going on in areas not affected by the disaster, including Tokyo metropolitan area, the opposition parties are not ready to join the government now. But after these local elections, it seems quite possible for the DPJ and some of the opposition to form a coalition government. Whether it becomes a grand coalition between DPJ and LDP, a minimum winning coalition between DPJ and Komeito, or a virtual coalition remains to be seen. Also, whether Mr. Kan survives as Prime Minister in such coalition is hard to judge. I would guess that a grand coalition with Mr. Kan as Prime Minister is possible, but again, whether that actually materializes remains to be seen. In any case, I would expect that some kind of coalition will be forged after the current local elections. It goes without saying that the DPJ needs to accept the demand of the opposition to virtually scrap many items in its manifesto, such as child care subsidy, free high school tuition, and free highway system that require huge budget. In a way, the disaster is a good excuse for the DPJ to revise some of its policies that are dubious fiscally and in their efficacy. In other words, a political ceasefire can continue under the current circumstances, in my judgment, at least for a year or so. As I said, the lower house election is impossible until reconstruction proceeds to some extent, until a new apportionment of electoral districts is made. In my observation, a general election is unlikely until 2013. It is now quite possible to have what we call the double elections of both lower house and upper house will take place in July 2013. Well, what will happen during this political ceasefire? First, on the international front, if my guess has some validity and the kind of coalition is formed, Japan's foreign policy will not change much. As the appreciation of the US help is extremely high, the alliance will become much more popular in Japan. However, given the domestic needs of reconstruction, Japan's overall international activities may be more constrained than before. The Japanese commitment of reducing greenhouse gas by 25% is now difficult to follow through, as Japan now has to depend more on oil and gas for electricity, at least for some time to come. What about the domestic policy implementations? It is quite possible that the Japanese politics spends most of the time by implementing minimum necessary measures of reconstruction. Well, given the scale of destruction, implementing minimum necessary efforts of reconstruction itself is quite hard. And given the hard choices to be made, political process of a coalition government can be as messy as in the recent past. But one needs not forget that Japan is also in a long-term crisis since the end of the Cold War. Efforts of reconstruction of this immediate crisis should be consistent with long-term efforts of rebuilding a new Japan. This is not the time for short-term political squabbles. The energy policy reform is urgent. With disaster of nuclear power plants, Japan needs to revise its energy policy. I think Japan cannot simply abolish nuclear power generation, but it needs to devise other measures to create a more sustainable energy future that might involve changes in lifestyle of all citizens. Reforms are needed in urban and rural land use policy. Those areas not devastated this time still require revisions of their planning. Large-scale earthquakes and tsunamis can happen in areas not affected this time. They have to prepare for a tsunami of the magnitude we saw last month. The Japanese have to maximally utilize lessons from the Great East Japan earthquake. For the reconstruction of the devastated areas, visionary urban-rural planning should be implemented. Model towns, safe, sustainable, friendly to aging population, and strong in agriculture, should be envisioned and constructed. Fiscal policy reform cannot wait. Huge money is needed for reconstruction, but Japan can no longer depend on government bonds indefinitely. Tax reform is necessary. Political reform is also necessary. During the coming year, the parliament must at least conduct a district system reform to reduce voting power disparity. Further, the parliament needs to reconsider the power of the upper house. In the coming months, Japanese politics has to deliver in terms of reconstruction, but it needs to be visionary and far-sighted. It has to overcome the immediate crisis and create the basis of a new Japan. With this, I'll end my presentation, and I would like to ask my colleagues to give their own observation. First, Michelle.
Dr. Tanaka, thank you. Thank you to USJI for putting this together, and thank all of you for coming today. And the overflow capacity of the room, I think, shows how much people here are still interested and concerned and worried about the situation in Japan and the important issues that we're trying to deal with as Japan goes forward. That this will clearly not be something that's short-term, but will shape and affect Japan for years, if not decades, to come. I guess from one perspective, it seems a bit indecent to be talking about politics and economics and whether